Welcome to Cars on Call. I am automotive journalist, and this time I'll say gastroenterologist because our guest, who is a BEV expert, is a gastroenterologist. His name is Mike Owens. And before we get to Mike, I'll say that I met Mike through actually a GI meeting years ago because he's a friend of one of my partners, and he's extremely knowledgeable about a lot of areas. And one of the areas is not just BEVs, but kind of climate, the future, CO2 emissions, and all that. So let me start, Mike, before you introduce yourself and give us your background. Any regular listener knows that I am a skeptic of BEVs. I think they're kind of a dead end, and I've made the point over a number of our episodes. And so have my partners. By the way, in case listeners are waiting for Dr. Stefan Moran, our trauma surgeon, or car collector consultant and expert Adam Sutson, they will not be here today. It's just a one-on-one with our BEV expert, Mike Owens. So anyway, I have made the point that, listen, the dogs don't seem to be eating the dog food, and there are a bunch of problems with BEVs, charging stations, unavailability, range, rings anxiety, change with temperature, that kind of thing. I've talked about that. So I want to get into all of that, and who better to do it than someone who knows a lot more about BEVs than me. So Mike, say hi, give us a little intro about yourself, and let's get into the BEV world.
I can see why you thought maybe having the car collector wouldn't really be helpful for BEVs right now.
There's no collector BEVs.
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah.
there might be. What the EV1 would be a collector car if they hadn't crushed them all.
They crushed them all. Yeah, yeah. And then Elon shot the first Tesla into space, so you can't collect that easy. That's a problem.
Although I've seen pretty high prices for the Tesla Roadster, the initial.
Yeah, a couple
from 15 years ago.
There were a couple, three found in the garage, I think, that went for significant pennies. But trauma, which is Stephen, right?
Stefan, yeah.
Stefan is trauma. I mean, that'd be fascinating sometime to chat with him about safety, just because I'm kind of curious his point of view, because it's all over the map. And I'll say right up front, I think that one of the big detriments to humanity is the internet. That was like the great information age will set us free, and now we're all just like dumber because it's like trying to figure out what's really going on. It's impossible, which is great because you're trying to I think cut through that with like people that know what they're talking about a little bit. And I met you, Steve, in Boise at one of the Duck Club events, which is phenomenal. And you were kind of a mentor and a friend, to me. And we started talking about BMW versus Audi, I think, where everything starts, kind of. I mean, that was great. And so this is a great opportunity. I appreciate it to throw out kind of thoughts that maybe you just don't gather in one article from one media source that often has an agenda that you don't know about, or, we see it all the time. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that, this maybe is not for public consumption, although I'll say it. I can only imagine your very, very deep embarrassment when I say that you owned a V8 Audi S4, I think. It's an S4 wagon, I think.
Avant manual. And I sold it to a great guy in Seattle who still reaches out every now and then. He still has it. And he still reaches out and he's like, God, thank you for taking such great care of this car before he sold it to me. That's kind of a classic. That's kind of a classic. The manual Avant S4, right?
Well, 20 years ago, and it was a great car. I've not driven the Avant. I drove the Avant when it was a V6 before it went to V8.
Yeah.
I drove a 6-speed S4 sedan, and I think it was 03, 02.
Yeah.
I loved it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the funny thing about the Avant, it was like over 4,200 pounds. And I mean, the tires just were screaming at me every time I took it to the track. It was like, what are you doing? Like, this pig is not excited to do this, and then here we are talking to EVs, and we'll get into like weight, and where we're at with ICE, right? So internal combustion engines and EVs and the weight differential,
Yeah, let me start with that. And Stefan has in fact, one of our very recent episodes, he talked about a video that you probably saw, and it was a Rivian going through a guardrail. Typically an EV, size-wise, will weigh 1 to 3,000 pounds more than its internal combustion equivalent. So there is a safety issue. Stefan calls it vehicle aggressivity. Talk about that. What do it's a problem now. What do you think of the problem, and what do you think is where we're going?
Well, if we step back for a second, one of the things that I think causes a lot of debate is like an EV is not an EV is not an EV. There's companies that have come late to the game that are typically legacy automakers that have traditionally had a lot less efficiency. They needed a lot more batteries to get the same range compared to those that started out earlier making EVs. And they went straight to heavier vehicles, and many of them in the US are making trucks, and that's their bread and butter. And so they're kind of not interested in making not trucks. And trucks are tough. That's a whole different game when it comes to battery electric. But if you look at like the performance Model 3, even before the refresh, it's the same weight as an M3. I mean, there's many models out there that are getting to the same weight in the sedan category. And that's true now for a number of different features, like the cost up front, even without subsidies. I mean, some of the things that we see about EVs are like, it's a heterogeneous like statement about what EV are you talking about. And it's also what year? So this is 2018 was kind of the beginning of actual reasonably decent EVs. Before that, you see all these stories about everybody's giving up on their EVs and selling them, but they were all like 100-mile range, 2016, 17 EVs, like the i3, the
Nissan Leaf is another.
And they're trying to get there, but like going to like 300 or 250-mile range EVs was relatively recent. So there's just so much heterogeneity in the talk that allows everybody to throw out a lot of information. And I think people just pick and choose which version they want to tell based on what the story is they want to say. But you have the converse to that on the weight is that it's very low to the ground. Your center of gravity is going to help on rollover events, right? So there's some definite benefits to the EV. There's no giant anvil in the front of your car that's going to hit another anvil and just have that massive force have to transfer into the cabin, and they had to like engineer around it, which is incredible what they've been able to do. But if you can take that out and you can make the whole front of the car just safety, and there's no other like detriment to the frontal crash, that helps too. So like, it's kind of interesting that we look at safety in one way from the weight, but on the other hand, you see like advantages that people may or may not build in. So you take the automakers that have like a chassis and a design that is an ICE, and they're like, let's just shoehorn a battery in. It's probably not going to be better. It's probably not going to be more efficient. It's probably not going to have better safety. But then if you design from the ground up, it's like a whole different model. I mean, I think engineers probably love that. So it's a heterogeneous topic, right?
Yeah, I think a Rivian, for example, is obviously a new vehicle. It's got a whole new platform, and it was designed from the ground up. And
Yeah.
a Rivian is roughly the size of a Chevy Tahoe,
Yeah.
but weighs more. It's about 8,300 pounds, about 8,000 pounds for a Rivian,
Yeah.
roughly. Obviously, the one you're talking about is something Stefan calls the Antichrist, which is the Hummer. Weighs about 9,000 pounds.
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
It's terrible.
200 kilowatt plus battery just to get the same range as others. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, aggressivity goes both ways. And, one point, of course, that Stefan has made, and Stefan does a lot of talking about safety,
Yeah.
which is highly educational. He's opened my eyes in many ways. Obviously, if you're the driver of a Rivian or a passenger in a Rivian, well, you have the advantage, that extra weight. You hit a Corolla, bad if you're in the Corolla, good if you're in the Rivian.
Yeah. Well, but that's true of all pickups versus a Corolla too. And pickups are like top selling vehicle in the US or SUVs, right? So it's kind of the same argument. That isn't a really EV ICE argument. It's size to some degree. I mean, the Cybertruck, whatever it is about the same weight as a ICE 150. I mean, the trucks are going to be a thing. It's going to be, I think the trucks for BEV are brand new to like the ideas of what could you do. And I think the folks that look at truck buyers and they see how the majority of truck owners use their truck could probably build a BEV that works for most of the uses that most truck owners do. I think that if you're trying to copy those people that need a truck and use a truck for a truck, you're not there yet. You know, it's going to be wild. We got to figure that out. That's okay.
Yeah, I
But
think we talked about this. We actually, I'm going to stop saying we talked about it because there's a lot of stuff we talked about. But I'll say this:
yeah, you read 105
if you
episodes.
if you look at truck buyers, most of them use it for personal use,
Yeah.
and they don't need it. I've made the point that, why don't they buy a Ford Maverick, which is a mini truck,
Those are great. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and you can't buy one because they're so popular. And
Yeah.
you don't need an F-150. You can go to Home Depot, you can go to Lowe's, get your stuff, and you can
Yep.
compute. You burn a lot less gas, and 90 to 95 to 98% of the use case you can take care of with a Maverick instead of an F-150. So yeah, talk about that from the standpoint of BEVs. For example, the Rivian truck or other trucks that may be coming, maybe the Cybertruck, whatever. But talk about trucks because that's something very uniquely American.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's where the big three are in a unique position too, right? I mean, compare that to like the auto houses in Germany and their mix of vehicles, and they have a whole different ball game. The US, they're just truck centric and they need to keep that going. And I think there's people who are hesitant. But look, I was looking at truck, suburban, 3 kids. We live in the Northwest. We go out like you all the time doing stuff. And I realized, well, you get a truck, it's great. You get your four-wheel drive, it's very utilitarian. I need that. But I'm going to put a camper top on it because I don't want my stuff to get stolen. I might sleep in the back. And now I'm looking at a van. And so now I bought a van and it's diesel and it's 18 miles to the gallon and it's not a BEV and we're going out in the middle of nowhere. And yet we just don't use it much. Like, is it the end of the world that you just keep your truck and use it for what you need it for? But like day to day, you don't really. I mean, not everybody can afford multiple cars. I mean, there's lots of things, but a lot of people keep an old truck no matter who they are, because they're like, I like my old truck and you need it and it's useful. Like
Right.
that works too. So maybe there's some in between that solves some of the problems that people just realize like, hey, look, most people in America, what's the average? They use like 1.5 to 2 cars per, the typical American
Yes.
family, right?
Yeah.
So is one of them an EV soon and the other is not yet? That's okay. Like we have years to like work on this whole like, hey, can we transition? It doesn't have to be overnight. It has to be done thoughtfully, and everybody has to look at like what works for them. And I think that's where the trucks are kind of fun right now. Like there's a lot of comparisons going on with the F-150 Rivian and the Cybertruck, and I think they're all like fascinating because there's great. I think you guys maybe should do like a little podcast on this, like it's truck centric talk. Like who's using which one, why, and like there's a lot of people like, and it's great. I mean, look, Ford versus Chevy. You can do a whole show on that. Nothing to do with BEVs. So now we're doing like Rivian Cybertruck Lightning. That's kind of cool too. I mean, it's still a car thing. I think the F-150 is great. I think it's amazing. What they pulled off is awesome. And there's a lot of friends and a lot of them out here in the Northwest, up on the ski slopes. There's a lot of F-150 Lightnings. There's a lot of people that are really, like taking them back and forth to the mountain. And you're not going to haul more than 100 miles with 5,000 or 6,000 pounds, but maybe those aren't families that really do that. They're not boaters. They don't pull a trailer that often. There are people that are okay with that. And it's early. This is like first gen trucks pretty much anywhere. So it's definitely a great debate. I think that,
Well, before you leave the Lightning,
yeah,
I do understand that it's the first generation. And obviously it's got to evolve. But I told the story of a good friend of mine, and he has a friend who had just bought a Lightning and loves it. So he took his boat and went up to our local reservoir and put the boat in and boated and came back. And this would have been last summer. So I think it was
yeah,
August. But it was not like 100 degrees. It was probably, 90 degrees, 85. And he had a full charge when he left. It's about 30 miles there and 30 miles back. And he had 17 miles to go. Pretty good sized boat, but
yeah.
certainly didn't come close to the towing capacity of the Lightning.
Yeah.
And he said, boy, I'm not doing that again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
of course, Ford just suspended production of the Lightnings because people are not buying them.
Yeah.
There is reluctance, as you know, even in California, Q3 and Q4 of 2023, total numbers of BEVs dropped. I mean, that's not compared to the year before, but it's compared to Q2. So we're seeing some buyer reluctance. Talk about what you see about buyer reluctance and maybe what the solution is.
Yeah. And I'll go and I'll just hit like two things real quick because you nailed them. Like we mentioned, towing is a huge thing. Remember when range anxiety first started, though, the key was putting in charging at a specific distance that was calculated to hit the sweet spot on charging, right? Like you charge a battery over 80%, it's going to take a lot longer to trickle charge it all the way to the top. You get down to like 10, 20% and below, it's going to take a little bit to condition the battery. So you have this sweet spot where you get like, in the old days, 150 miles of range as fast as you can. So they put the chargers like a certain distance. Well, with towing, it's going to be a different ballgame, which is kudos to Rivian for putting in charging where people might go in the outdoors instead of doing the Tesla thing and the highway, like, and let's get you there. They kind of copied the Tesla destination charging idea, which is like, that's great. I'm going to a hotel, an Airbnb, going to a conference. I got to stay at a place that's got charging. That was kind of the 2018 goal back when EVs were just starting. So maybe with charging, that's what's going to happen. It's going to happen with semis. The Megapack charging, it's going to be a certain number of miles. It's only going to work for certain freight. That freight's going to be lighter. It's going to be Frito-Lay. It's going to be Pepsi. There's thoughts to it probably. But the other really cool trick that's coming, and you may have seen this, is electric motors and batteries in the trailer. And so if you want to make a lot of money, let's start looking at some of the companies that are doing this. So Airstream and two other RV makers have put trailers together, single axle, and they're single axle, but they actually can control. You don't need a sway bar on your towing anymore because the motor and battery in the trailer can control some of the things that happen with the action of towing something that heavy. And it in an ice truck will offset the range loss you get from towing. So you can sell them to everybody. You can put them on semis. Just start proliferating all these things. And all of a sudden the towing goes away because your battery and you have your daily range and you need more. Like, why carry around a giant battery just to tow a couple times a year? Then why put the expense there? You're not a guy who doesn't need to tow. And if you are, you're going to buy like a Airstream that has it all built in. It's going to be the same price. Airstream's always pricey.
Yeah, I've heard about that. Talk a little bit more about that, Mike, because what you're talking about, just in case anyone missed it, is instead of putting 100% of the battery and 100% of the power plant in the vehicle that's towing whatever you're towing, you just have a trailer. Let's say it's a flatbed trailer, and you're gonna tow whatever
your Ferrari to the track.
Your Ferrari to the track or whatever, and you're gonna tow it. Well, it's not an empty trailer that's got a battery pack in it, and it can drive the wheels of the trailer.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, instead of the vehicle doing all the work, the trailer's doing part of the work, a significant part of the work. So talk more about that, because I had heard about Airstream and other trailers.
Yeah.
But go into that a little bit more, because that seems interesting.
Well, I mean, is battery, so the learning curve on tech, right? So as battery pack prices are getting lower and lower, down to like less than 100 per kilowatt hour now, $100 per kilowatt hour. Tesla's probably at 75. For stationary storage is 200 to 300. They're going to have some other options that are not even lithium. They're going to be like $50. As that comes down, you can see entrepreneurs out there. They're going to be like, hey, this stuff is kind of cheap. Why don't we just stick it on a trailer and we can sell all new trailers? We can sell all new RVs, flatbeds, whatever you want. And people will buy them because it's going to save them on their gas. It won't even just save them on their EV. It's like your F-150 or 250 or Super Duty. You're not going to have to worry about like burning a ton of gas because it's offset by the EV that you charge. People are putting in charging dual direction too. So you have your trailer sitting there. It's out all day. It's getting solar. It's getting not much, maybe, another 30 to 50 watts of range or miles of range equivalent. But you want to charge up your truck when you get back to the campsite. You can pull it off of you got two now. You got like kind of like a backup essentially, and use it to run all your power on anything. And So like the bidirectional charging, like the trucks being able to charge other cars or all your power, or who knows, like charge your jet skis. You've got it's a personal watercraft that are electric now. The Tiaga guys
Yeah.
that are making the snowmobiles, and there's a video out, you can charge your snowmobile in the back of the Cybertruck, which it fits. It's like there's thoughts that are kind of fun if you're like want to think outside the box. And really, you're going to tow your Ferrari to the track and you're going to go fill the thing up with race fuel and you're going to have a great day. And then you're going to just EV back home. That's awesome. Like, no one's harmed. It's great. And you get to keep your awesome car. It's just, you're not using it a ton, it's the emissions are offset. So I think that's one thing about the towing that may make a lot of sense. And I think a lot of folks haven't yet grasped. It could be not just like RVs, it could be any trailer, and it could help. A lot of people look at saving money, and people who do fleets and have towing, they're going to look at what we can save money. Like, what's the ROI? What's the, is that 2 years? Do we buy all new trailers next year? Which ones do we get? A little more expensive? How much more? We set that aside for a minute, and we're like, that's going to pay for itself in a year and a half or something. I mean, there's going to be numbers that come along that are like, okay, there's maybe some solutions there. You mentioned hydrogen, that's kind of early phase. I mean, there's some places that are shutting their hydrogen stations down, like just not like moving stuff around is not as easy as moving electrons around. You want to get into like the grid and how stable it is with all this electricity demand and all this great stuff, I'm sure.
I don't want to get into that yet, because the whole trailer thing, which I do think is extremely interesting and exciting. But here's what I would say, and I'm getting to the trailer, but
Yeah.
One of my partners, I don't know if you know Ashley Evans, but she's very smart.
Oh, I do know who she is. I actually seen her name a bunch.
Yeah. So about 5 years ago, she said, I'm thinking of buying a used i3. What do you think? I said, beautiful. It's perfect.
Yeah.
Because I knew what she was going to do, which is go
Yeah.
back and forth to work and never go to the gas station.
Yeah.
Ever.
Yeah.
And she does, 80 miles of range. She only needs, 40. And if she goes to the store, maybe it's 50, maybe 60. But it works. But she has to have an internal combustion engine SUV to take the kids around,
Yep.
any trip, that kind of stuff.
Yep.
So that's kind of where we are. And the reason I mentioned that as a really good solution, and it makes me nervous about the trailer, is she's using her i3 every day, which is how you want to use a battery.
Yeah.
You want to charge it optimally and use it every day. If
Yeah.
you have an Airstream,
Yeah.
it's maybe 2 trips a year, 3 trips a year. All of a sudden you've got, and the same with a towing trailer. You may have a trailer that sits idle, and now all of a sudden you're talking about battery decay, and battery degradation is a concern of people that are reluctant to buy BEVs. Talk about
okay, so let's think it through. What could you do? Now, not everybody has the option, but could you leave your trailer at home? Because then in certain states, you're going to plug your trailer into your house, and it's going to be your battery backup for your house. And you're going to take your solar and you're going to charge that battery, and you're going to sell all the extra back to the utility company, and you're going to pay for your trailer partially by selling electricity while it's just sitting there, if you have a big enough place to park the trailer.
Well, most people don't.
Most people don't.
Most
people don't. So then you could
it's at a storage facility, which
you put it
is
in
where
storage.
most RVs are.
So you put it in a storage facility. Now the storage facility wants to make money on your battery because it's sitting at their lot. And so they want to basically take electricity. You don't even be solar charged, right? You can just take electricity coming in at, like, here it's 14 cents during the day. It's 4 cents at night. So you can take and store your electricity at night and then sell it during the day, and arbitrage is 10 cents. So a smart RV storage park is going to make money off of everybody parking their stuff there. And then you're going to pay them to keep it there too. So I think there's crazy thoughts going on about, like, what does this all mean? And I don't think the solutions are there yet, but I think the intrigue is definitely, like, out there a little bit. But you're right.
What's also out there, and the reason I mentioned degradation is, I'm sure you've seen this, but people who take their BEV in, and it's 10-year-old BEV, and they say, well, to swap out the batteries, it's going to be $20,000, $30,000.
Yeah.
That would make anybody nervous.
Sure would. So have you seen, like, recent data about how much degradation happens and how often those kinds of swaps are happening? I mean, it's really pretty rare. the battery management's key, software is key, quality of who you're buying from is key. A bunch of the 2018 and earlier, those were air-cooled batteries in the US, except for a few, like the Fiat, and they all died. And they were small batteries and they were still like 10 grand to replace. And then your car's useless. Those are junk. No one's collecting those. The modern software managed battery controlled batteries are lasting for 200,000 miles easy. It's a decade. I mean, it's a very different world a little bit. And then the chemistries are all changing. So NCM or LFP, or now, like you mentioned, sodium ion, or then solid state. And no one's exactly sure where those are going, but the engineers behind it are definitely interested. You saw that like a lot of the legacy auto companies didn't have great battery tech, and they outsourced it. LG, Samsung, CATL, and a lot of those companies are switching from prismatic or pack or pouch batteries to cylindrical because of the benefits of battery management. And losing one cell doesn't mean you're losing a whole pack. You're not losing, a prismatic pouch. And so I think that those original fears are starting to become more allayed as the decades gone on since 2014, when it was really early days. So I don't see the amount of worry that used to be there. And then the long-term goal is you're going to recycle that battery, you're going to get money for it, and you're going to basically not have the same price to change it. Battery swapping was looked at for a long time, and it just really didn't pencil to say, oh, you can just swap out your battery. You can just use a different one every time you travel. I think we're stuck with, you have your battery, treat it well, plug it in when it's cold, to keep it nice and warm and toasty, even if it's just a little 110 outlet. Make sure that you look at what your manufacturer says is important on the charging capacity. When you go to charge, don't charge to 100% in some of them. Others, they're fine going to 100%. Look, we got a dog now too. This is good. Steve's podcast has got our dog on it.
It's the first one.
Is that it? Well, Lily wanted to say hi, Steve. So that definitely you have to pay attention. Some of the Porsche, they were very protective of their batteries and the Titan. And the newer version, now you've seen the update, that's fascinating how fast they've gone to really modern era, like range efficiency. We're getting into the 4 watts per kilowatt hour, which is like miles per gallon, right? Sorry, 4 miles per kilowatt hour. So you can kind of think about what was that. And a lot of the earlier 2020 era cars are like 2. We almost doubled like how many miles you can go with the same kilowatt hour. So it's real, the range anxiety, the charging, the degradation, the real problems, but they're also ones that people have been looking at, I think, pretty hard. And I think that there's an upswing. If I can loop back, you mentioned Q4 versus Q2 in California, pick a state. There's seasonal variation too in sales. There's also been some fairly serious inflation going on, and all auto sales dropped a lot, right? And even though they dropped in ICE automaker sales data, EV still went up, just not quite as much. And it was still 50% growth year over year. Most of the numbers that people predicted, 10 million worldwide sales in 2023 happened. It was 9.9. So the growth curve is if you look at it globally, you smooth out the seasonal variation, it's still there. People are predicting a slowing growth in 2024, but I think it's all just kind of dependent on where we're at with the economy and inflation and everybody's pocketbook, and all large purchases are going to get hit. And I don't think it's fair really to call out one segment or another. Do you? I mean, you have to look at it with a little more of a global perspective.
Here's what I'm seeing, and that is that the enthusiasts got in the game, really with the Tesla Model S. And I do use a little bit of, I don't want people to get the idea that I'm always at cocktail parties, but I do socialize, and I talk cars. And I found it interesting that as the years go by, the cars that people are excited and want to talk about change.
Yeah.
In the 80s, people want to talk about BMW and Mercedes. In the 90s, it was all Lexus.
Yeah.
In the 2000s, it was mostly Audi. And 2010s, it was all Tesla. Well, when's the last time you went to a party and talked cars and people want to talk about an American brand? The answer is probably the muscle car
Yeah.
back in the 60s and early 70s. So Tesla was kind of exciting. It was really embraced with enthusiasm. And as that enthusiasm grew, it was like a wildfire. That supercharger network was brilliant, much more brilliant than I gave it credit for at the time. And so this thing just kind of grew and took on a life of its own, and then that spread to other brands. But as reality starting to set in, and these problems that we've talked about have come up, there is this reluctance. And again, we'll see what happens. I want to get your take on this, because on the one hand, it's good that there is progress. And I've made the point that this is a little bit like cell phones. Before we got the iPhone, cell phones changed all the time, and you never knew. They changed so often that you got a new one and the old one was basically worthless. Well, I saw an ad for a Taycan. You talked about the Taycan. It was
Yeah.
a Taycan Turbo S. It was a 3-year-old, 19,000 miles. The MSRP was about 168,000 miles, or $1,000, and the price to buy it now is 81,000. Or it's sold for 81,000. So as the technology changes and improves, obviously your resale value is
Yeah.
going to go down. I tell people, if you're going to get a BEV now, lease it. But number one, what is your thought about that, the value, and how
Yeah.
that may contribute to reluctance? And then number two, the holy grail, which is always over the horizon. When are we going to get solid state batteries?
Yeah. I mean, bleeding edge tech's always expensive. I mean, I'm not buying the Apple Vision Pro goggles now. I probably will hopefully never buy it. I don't want to live with like computers in my eyeballs. I guess now we're both gray. Look, you did it. I'm gray now too. So that's always a challenge. I think smart folks research their cars, and they research like what's the sweet spot. Don't buy brand new, buy a couple years old, let the depreciation curve, for all cars, right? You're going to let the depreciation go a little, certain model years, certain configurations. Like that's the car lovers like favorite thing to do. Go searching around for those deals. And the depreciation hit recently is a bit artificial, but across the board, all cars, because the supply chain issues that happened just drove the cost of goods through the roof. And all automakers had to make a choice. Are they going to like raise the prices of their car or not? And it depends on the demand. So if you can't raise the price of your car because they're not selling, you're stuck with losing money because your cost of goods are up 20% in 2021, 22.
Yeah.
That's it. If you've got demand, you can raise your prices. People will buy them. Maybe they're not thinking, maybe they're not smart, and they're going to hit some pretty serious depreciation when that transient event hit. So if you look kind of before the supply chain cost of an average BEV, you're going to see a straight line of it going down, but it's not the steep up and down you saw from the supply chain era. And so I think people can definitely choose if they're going to be bleeding edge. You can still look at what can I get that's 2 years old, that's at least still good tech, that probably you're going to be able to sell. And I think that the spread on like this car could be junk. This could be like a very niche car, like an i3 BMW. It's a great kid car. It's a great get your kids to high school and back. You can get them cheap. We got a Fiat 500 E500 for our kids because it's a liquid cooled battery. We got it for $9,000, and they fight over who drives it because no one wants to drive the hand-me-down great aunt's car that gets 8 miles to the gallon. It's like an old 2005 LX or Lexus RX 330, and they don't want to drive it, because they don't pay for gas. So there's that niche. And then there's like, okay, 2020, 21, there's numbers of cars. People are buying up the bolts after the batteries were replaced because you're great deals for the right person in that middle class family. And so you're in this like learning curve of the industry, and we're headed towards 38, 36, $39,000 EVs this year. The costs coming from China on some of their BEVs is going to just upend the markets, I think. And I think that we're trying hard in the US to support the big three, and we're being a little isolationist and nationalistic and keeping out the flood of cheaper BEVs that are out there from China, Korea. There's some really good cars, but they're not going to flood the markets. Though some of the companies, Kia and Hyundai, are building factories to assemble They're trying to get battery factories built so they can get those sweet incentives, right? And I know you have questions about incentives. But that was kind of the IRA is let's focus on keeping American car companies on track and not just like let them die because all this competition comes in like 1980s from Japan, right? So I think you have to be smart if you're going to look at depreciation. Are you going to get a luxury car right off the lot? It's a different deal. We're getting towards BEVs not being the initial, we got to make something that's kind of luxury car prices. The trucks are luxury car priced. It's crazy. Of course, ICE trucks are kind of ridiculously pricey too anymore, right? Like a well-kitted out Lariat. What's that run for nowadays? It's like 70.
10 years ago, you could get a nice F-150 for $40,000, a nice one, and now they're 80.
80.
It's like 70 to 80
Yeah.
for the equivalent. The price has basically doubled in 10 years.
It's crazy, right? Yeah. So I think it's all part and parcel of the same part of like the industry versus change in the industry, new tech, the spec. Yeah, it's all this. It's kind of the same stuff, really.
And what about solid state batteries? It seems like
They're always around the corner.
Right. It's the answer. You mentioned battery swapping. I've always thought that was a good idea. And Tesla, of course, got, as you probably know, a big payout for setting up a battery swapping center in California that never swapped a single battery.
Never used it. Yeah. It didn't pencil. And they did this. China just tried this too, and they're not penciling. People it's how do you get, like, who wants to go to a station? Like, you get so used to just leaving your house and coming home. You want to go to a gas station. Like, why would you go? Where is the battery? There are not going to be many battery swap stations. Like, how are you going to get like 10 miles away to go swap your battery? It's logistically kind of hairy. And then which battery did you get? Like, who had it before you? What if you get stuck with that one for a while and it's got some issues or something? So I don't think
you can see that the theory is nice because it takes, maybe 10 minutes to swap out a battery, whereas you're sitting there for 45 minutes if there's no line. So
right. So but what if you're up to 180 miles in 15 minutes, which is where we're getting for the V4 superchargers. Everybody's moving to the North American charging standard. All the automakers are switching.
Right.
Tesla's superchargers are $19,000 per stall, which is 1/5 the cost of all the other charging manufacturers per stall cost, which is crazy. And I mean, maybe they're taking even a little loss on it just to get them out there. But if everybody's going to switch to that for charging, what's the goal there? Is Tesla just trying to make money off of the electrons, I guess, or are they just trying to promote more sales and they think they'll win? I don't know. But I think the battery swap, kind of the folks we're looking at, well, charging is going to get better faster, right? We have 48-volt architecture in EVs now. Like, components for 48-volt electrical systems in automotive didn't exist until like this year. And that lowers your copper gauge required and the amount of it in your car by like over half. Everything's lighter, cheaper, faster. I think that's where they saw the numbers and were like, why will we build out 10,000 battery swap stations and all those extra batteries just sitting there waiting for someone to pick them up?
I agree. I agree. It doesn't make sense. What is your sense of solid state? Because again, it seems attractive. At the same time, I've heard that if it gets cold, it's even worse charging. It's harder. So talk about that, because maybe some listeners think it's the panacea. Maybe you do.
But I think the daily use case. So it's kind of like range plus. Is there a difference in degradation with solid state? And no one's really figured out if the degradation is going to be better. And the range, it's like people could get to 500. You could put enough batteries into vehicles to get to 500-mile cars, but batteries are constrained. There's supply chain restrictions on batteries, right? There was a good article I read that suggested, as of last year, that the number of automakers projected volumes of BEVs by 2030 and the number of batteries that were projected to be made by 2030 meant that there was only going to be enough for half of those. It means half of those automakers are not going to be building those cars. So they want to use less battery per car, plus it's lighter weight, plus they're getting better efficiencies, right? We're getting to 2 to 3 to 4 miles per kilowatt hour. That maybe solid state's not as necessary as we thought. In fact, we've gone the other way. We have LFP now, which everyone said was like ridiculous, right? But it's like, it's a cheaper works for most people, not as great for power, not as great for a number of things. So you're going to have like different chemistries based on the type of vehicle. And now you have sodium ion, which is like even different than LFP as far as no one thought it was going to be efficient enough, but it's so cheap. I mean, it's like, I mean,
Yeah.
you don't, there's
Tons
no
of
lithium
sodium everywhere.
refining. It's like, it's everywhere. And so maybe that works instead. So I think there's, again, it's just like early days, like you say, but people are getting to a place where some of the early ideas are, some are working, some are not. And the other thing that's funny is solid state, the news about that, it weirdly always comes from Toyota about the time that they're having some issues in the media and they kind of like need to put a press release out and they're like, ooh, new solid state battery. And you're like, we've heard this before. Is this really going to happen? Or so I don't see like a lot of the Chinese, I believe. This is like geopolitics, right? But the Chinese have a very strong incentive to not use oil. They don't have any.
Right.
And they're up against the West, who has control of all the oil for the most part. There's lots of battles about it. So their incentive here to go big on anything that gets them off oil is, for better or worse, there. And they definitely have been pushing hard on that. Whereas the US has been really had an oil-based infrastructure that didn't really benefit us as much to pivot, and our distances and our cities and all that, it didn't make as much sense. So I think when you see where things are coming from in the news, if it's from China, it's like, we might need to pay attention to that. They're very incentivized. The CCP is subsidizing like crazy. I mean, they probably have 250 EV companies, startups that have come in, and it's many gone, and they're going to consolidate to probably a dozen. And they're just happy with that. They're like, yeah, sure, that's what will happen.
Now, let me take you back to a point you made, because this actually dovetails with a guest we had from JD Power. And I want to get your thoughts about this. And that is the amount of battery that we can make versus the amount of vehicles that we need. There's a mismatch there. And what Toyota says is they don't just talk about solid state. They say, hey, if you take the battery, the amount of weight of a battery, the amount of density of a battery, and instead of putting it in a BEV, you put it in a hybrid, plug-in hybrid or a regular hybrid, you can get, it's something like 5 plug-in hybrids and 20 non-plug-in hybrids, and you're getting CO2 benefits without going all the way to BEV. But they're not the only ones. It's not just Toyota, and some other companies have talked about that, but mostly JD Power has. And JD Power, who really has their finger on the pulse of the customer, is saying, customers are not excited really about BEVs currently, at least with the current technology, but they're very excited about hybrids. And we had a guy named Gino Effler on, who's high up at JD Power, and he said, for 5, 10, maybe 15 years, it's hybrids. What do you say to that?
Great points. This is a tough one because I think there's many layers. I think that the recent pivot that's happened at VW, that happened at GM, Ford, just this past year to go back to hybrids is because they can't make EVs at volume and they can't get the batteries and they don't have a way to compete and they're losing money hand over fist. And if they're Kodak and your money's on film, Kodak had a digital camera. They bought Shutterfly. They were ready to go. But their business model and the quarter-to-quarter finance sheet looked not good. And if they were going to pivot 100% fast, so a slower transition is always better when you're a legacy industry. And I think that's a big reason why their sales, when you see the news about, and you saw this, like, the EVs are sitting on lots. Well, those people that had dealers that had lots, that's true. But if you don't have dealers, they were selling like hotcakes. The dealers didn't want to sell them. They get all the money on service. And the service, profits on EVs are very small. There's not much to do. It's like, windshield wiper fluid. You might change the brake pads once in your life. You might have a 12-volt battery and not a lithium-ion battery as your backup. So I think that was a big part.
His point was, and he did talk about this. His point was, listen, there's a lot of people where a BEV becomes a pure BEV is really difficult, whereas a hybrid works. For example, someone in an apartment where they have to park in the street. Anyone who has to park in the street.
Yep.
And
more rural, longer distance.
People who modest incomes, they can only afford one car for two people.
Right.
You gotta go see your in-laws, and they're 2 hours away. You got to do that,
But they're in a
5
weird
times a year,
direction. Yeah, and there's no charging in that direction.
that kind of
So
thing. So we're all of a sudden, those use cases, you get the benefits of lower emissions, but you also, you carry your generator in the car, as Adams Hudson has said. I like that. What are your thoughts?
okay, so UC Davis and ICC.org did a study on this, looking at 2030 and 2040 emissions targets, and looked at real world use of hybrids, plug-in hybrids, right? Plug-in hybrids. So you're not like just doing regen on the battery, you're plugging in at night. And what they found is that we don't meet our emission targets if we use hybrids. It's not even close. So there's a part of the push that's that, and the fleet turnover takes a decade. So if you are pushing people, if you're going to subsidize things, you're subsidizing something that won't meet the goals as like a government, then why are you doing it? Because people are going to have the hybrids for a decade, and they're not going to then go sell it and buy a BV 3 years from now, when it's like BVs have 500-mile range and charging's at every convenience store. Like gas stations make money on food, not gas. So they're going to want 10-stall charging. They are like crazy. The Nebby's going nuts with places that have convenience marts associated with the planned charging stations. There was a guy named John Peterson back on Seeking Alpha years ago who pushed that idea. Like, if you only have so many batteries, then they should be spread across everybody. But that was the one flaw, is like you're not taking into account fleet turnover. So if you can get BEV, if you can ramp battery production faster than you can turn over a fleet, that made more sense from a policy point of view. But from a consumer point of view, you're very right. Like, a lot of people have the kids, they're going to go drive, they need a 7-seat, 8-seat car. They're going to grandma's who lives 2 miles from the main highway. They're thinking hybrid, but most of those people have 2 cars, right? And so we don't need to worry about the SUV yet. And they might drive it just on the weekends. And they might even see like that their city car becomes something that they become comfortable in as no, I can drive to Seattle. It's 300-mile range. I don't even have to stop and charge between Portland and Seattle. And you get more comfortable. So your one of 2 cars is great. The third thing is, like, 80% of Americans, so we live in a place that's not very dense, 80% live in a place they can charge at home or work. And apartment condo dwellers are an important thing to address. It's going to be last, though. It's going to be slow, right? I mean, these are folks that may have other options. I mean, as a car guy, you will appreciate that I have a lot of concerns about the folks that are like, hey, we're just going to rebuild America like it's Europe, and we're just going to have trains and bike paths. And if you look at it, like, the reality of that is,
Good luck with that.
75% of Americans live in a metro area, but 50% of Americans live in the suburbs. So, like, you're going to have to rebuild the entire suburbs of the US to do that. How long is that going to take? And then what are the emissions to rebuild a whole city versus just using a little bit of gas, right? Like, that's a great comparison that no one thinks about. So I think that there's truth in there. I think the hybrids are going to be a part of the solution. I think the plugins are going to help. I think there's going to be needs to be options for everybody. But I think it's like short-sighted to think that we aren't going to ramp battery production. I mean, the lithium deposits that have been found, the sodium ion options are out there. We're getting the first lithium refinery in the US this year. Like, there's a lot of effort going into it. It may just be that charging network and battery availability and range and efficiency all get better faster than the PHEVs can actually take off and take over. So there's going to be a war, which is good.
It's going to be interesting. The point I've made, and I'll make it to you, is that I'm not anti BEV. One of the best cars I've driven in the last couple of years was Porsche Taycan, and
those are great.
It drove like a Porsche, and I have one, and it was really, really nice. But the technology.
And did you lease?
I was a test car, so I was
okay.
about it. It was a press car. So
I didn't answer your question about lease. I'll get back to it if you want, but don't let me interrupt you.
Yeah. So I do like it, but I think a lot of the hyperbole and the predictions of this happening really quickly. For example, I think any entity that says, at least in the United States, that says you're not going to be able to sell new internal combustion engine cars after 2035 is completely unrealistic. There was an analyst on Automotive News podcast, and Automotive News really is the industry
Yeah, right.
newspaper. He said the tipping point where we get to 50% market share for BEVs is 2028. And he said this 2 years ago. And I thought, where is all this coming from? There's too many hurdles that have to be overcome. I think they will be overcome, but it's going to take time. And until then, we just have to be ready for some turbulence and be maybe a little bit patient.
I try to parse like automotive news that has a lot of ties to the industry from the folks I read that are hyperbolic about EV growth. Like the truth is somewhere in between. And I enjoy trying to, like, in my head, pierce their arguments a little bit. It's like the auto dealers network involved in this discussion is, I mean, some of the legacy automakers, their profits are like 80% go to suppliers. There's 200 suppliers per car. It's like crazy, and they aren't moving fast enough, and they're very at risk of being disrupted, right? And disruption happens fast, like iPhones, right? It's like, which year is that going to happen? And if you look at the tech curve, that S curve, we're past the inflection point. If you look at the growth numbers, it's true that the US may grow slower. We've been laggards, although we're still like, what, 8% of all sales are BEVs this year? And globally is like 13. But there's so many cars being sold elsewhere in the world that it doesn't do us any good to be that far behind. If the rest of the world's already moving on and we're the only ones like that far behind, we've never not been leaders in things. But there's so many entrenched interests. I'm just not sure what to believe sometimes. So there's a few people, I should send you this graph. There's a guy who put out a chart from 2020 that nailed 2023, end of 2023 so far on sales numbers. And that's despite or maybe because of the difference in the recession and inflation that hit and changed the markets. But it'd be fun to look back in 2 years and see okay, 2025, where are we?
Yeah,
on
the one hand, disruption.
We're going to find out which way it's going, right?
We're absolutely going to find out. And, on the one hand, disruption, can happen fast, but I always think of the cell phone. I remember, Mike, reading about the cell phone, the New York Times. I was visiting my girlfriend in Massachusetts, and I saw the New York. I'll never forget it because it blew my mind. Front page, and it was talking about cellular phones.
Yeah.
And I'm like, wait a second, a phone you can carry around?
Yeah.
It was incredible. And it talked about the cell towers and everything. This was 1983.
Yeah.
And it was 24 years later that we got the iPhone. Yeah. So that's pretty slow disruption. And it's the same kind of thing because it's ubiquitous. Everyone has a car now. Everyone eventually will have some kind of car that is lower emissions. Yeah. And again, who knows what that iPhone, because people in 1983 couldn't imagine an iPhone. I don't think we can imagine what the BEV or the self-driving iPhone is going to be. What do you think about that?
Well, do you think that first cell phone was like the EV1, or was it like the Nissan Leaf? Where are we starting our clock?
I would start it even
like
before.
The bag phone, the big bag phone. Is that the first cell phone? Or like Michael Douglas on the beach, Street is good. Which one's the first?
There was an electric car that came out during the gas crisis in the 70s. I think it was called the Fairchild. So I think it's that.
You want to go that far back? All right.
I go that far back.
We got to pick the right starting spot, right? But I think that
but to answer your question seriously, I think the big bang of the modern BEV was the Tesla Model S, because all of a sudden, number one, it had the charging infrastructure. This is not some tech guy who did it in his garage. This is like legit. It was a nice car. It was nice to drive. People looked at it and said, holy crap, this is for real.
Yeah, it's not a piece of junk.
It was as nice as a Mercedes as far as materials and getting into it and that kind of thing.
Sort of, yeah.
But close enough.
Close enough.
Nicer than a Chevy, nicer than a Buick.
Hey, it convinced me to buy one.
That's what I think is, that was the big bang for me.
But I think that the iPhone moment, the 2008 moment, was maybe around Tesla Model 3 in 2018, because it was kind of for the masses. Like the iPhone kind of was for the masses. Like everybody wanted one. And by everybody, I mean, people rich in the West with the money to afford a cell phone at that era. And that's kind of like where 2018 was. And then you saw all these other companies just kicking off, Polestar and all these other startups were happening, Lucid and Rivian and Fisker was trying. And then, you had all the Chinese startups about the same time, 2018, everyone's copying each other. Like it was just starting. But I kind of feel like that's like maybe where we start the clock on like iPhone 2008 was like 2018 for EVs. And then you should look at the charts. Who knows? But, it's a global phenomenon too. That's the funny thing. It's like automotive is global. And it's going to be really interesting how that plays out when everyone is used to kind of how they all play together, shared parts. Everybody's using transmissions from a lot of the same suppliers and a lot of the same software, a lot of the same computer chips, and a lot of the same very old programming and wiring harnesses. And there was like a lot of like, we're fat and happy for a long time. And so this is like upending that, right? A little bit. It's like anything is possible.
Yeah, if you are, as you say, fat and happy, the last thing you want is change. You want the status quo. Okay, we're almost out of time, Mike, but I want to give you, a forum here to just say, okay, you more than anyone I know really have thought about this in a very deep way, and you know a lot and you've had a lot of experience. So where do you think we're going? How long do you think it's going to take? And, what are some major milestones along the way when you kind of map out, okay, this is where I think people are happy, and a mainstream, a teacher married to a firefighter who now has a Camry and a RAV4.
Yeah.
They are like, we want a BEV. Where are we going? How does that person, what do you see, and when is that person, instead of having a CRV and a Camry, they're going to have two BEVs, and what's that going to be like?
You're going to get me on the record with predictions. Damn it.
Yogi Berra once said making predictions is hard, especially about the future.
Yeah.
You probably didn't say it, but I like it.
Let's think about this. So like the top seller is a CUV, right? Everyone's buying CUVs.
Yeah.
Like 45, and that's just US. Let's just do US. It's easier. And if everyone's buying CUVs, everyone's trying to make them. Like, it's so funny. Like the Mach-E is called an SUV. I'm like, they're all CUVs, and moms are driving the CUVs. Dads or dads are driving the CUV. Let's just say dads with kids. Mom's got the other job. And we're talking about middle America, not apartment dwellers. So it's like, let's look at the majority, 70, 80% of the US. I think everyone's got a electric car by 2027, 28, a electric car in that group, just in that demographic, and all the other outliers. So it's not going to be everywhere all at once. But can we hit the 50% of sales by 2027, 28, our BEV? There's people projecting that, right? This BNEF and others, and sometimes they've been aggressive and sometimes not. But I think there's a little bit of a groundswell coming that's going to be hard to stop. And remember, it only took like 3% change in oil demand to crash the markets in the oil market in 2008. This is going to be really bumpy for the entrenched interests, right? They're going to have to decide what to do. I feel like there may be a lack of commitment on the big three, that they're choosing to just die slowly a little bit and see what happens. Their labor costs just went up a ton, and they were looking at, Ford split off the electric business from their ICE business in their spreadsheets, right? Like entirely. So you can see what the hit is. And I think it scared everybody. Volkswagen, the families at Volkswagen BAG, they were not happy with the plans that were in place with Herberges, and Bloom's like, we'll back off a little bit. Let's take it a little bit slower. So at most, I would say that most folks who are buying a CUV right now are looking at buying a CUV in the future that's BEV by like 27, 28. Yeah. And trucks, who knows? And all the other outliers are going to figure out some different kind of mix mash of things. And hybrids will have a little like growth boom. And then I think it'll kind of constrict again as everyone's like, I'm not sure I really need that. If we have like the other car, maybe I got like a bigger truck that I need to pull my boat. That's my family car. I can have an electric vehicle too. So it's in there. Because the key with emissions isn't just like what you're buying. It's also like, what do you do every day? Like we're trying to reduce emissions in a way that we like reduce the travel a little bit, reduce like the massive inefficiency of what everybody's doing. And it might even be the people are like, hey, remote work's great for like half of Americans doing it 3 days a week. And maybe all of a sudden people are driving different. I mean, there could be some changes coming that we just can't predict, like you said.
All right. That will be the final word. And I very much appreciate your knowledge, Mike. And
I appreciate your time. It's great chatting with you.
yeah, it's fantastic. So anyway, that's it. We're out of time, and I will just play Stefan Moran here and say, listen, subscribe, and come back and go to our website, carsoncallpodcast.com. And Mike Owens, thank you so much.
Steve, good luck with the podcast. It's taken off.